Well, we continue through Ecclesiastes here. And at the close of chapter 6, the author of Ecclesiastes, the one who calls himself the preacher, asks a question about what is good. He asks the question, what is good for man in the days of his life? What is good? That's kind of a big question. What is good? Now, we think we might know that stuff. I mean, if I said, what is good, you might say, well, all kinds of things might be good. Depends upon the context, Nice weather is nice. I mean, when the sun is shining, that's good. I mean, rain is good too. My daughter made some banana bread out there. I think it's pretty good. It depends on what we're talking about here. What is good? What is better? What is best? And that's what the author of Ecclesiastes is calling us to here as chapter 7 opens up here. It's calling us to look at what is best. It's calling us to look towards something better. And we might think we know, especially as adults in the room, there's some people who aren't adults in the room, but especially as adults in the room, we might know that certain things are better than other things. We might know that things like fiber and vitamins and medicine and things like that are good for us, versus maybe as kids they don't necessarily understand all that. But today's passage is calling us to look towards what is best. It's calling us to look towards what is good versus what is best. And I don't normally do this, but I have some props. So this is Girl Scout cookies. All right. My favorite one, Caramel Delights. They used to be called Samoas. Now they're Caramel Delights. And then in this hand I have broccoli. Now, broccoli is my least favorite vegetable. I get a thumbs down over here. And so we have cookies and broccoli. Now, if I was to say to you, what is good? Right? I know this is good, right? If I was to say to you what is better, as adults, there's children in the room, guys, okay? For their sake, we are contractually obligated to say this is better, right? We know that this is better. Huh? Yeah. So by dipping this into something that's actually not good, then this can become, that's cheating. But we have this thing here. We have, this is wonderful. It's really not good for me. This, I might as well just go start chewing on a tree outside. But it's good for me, even if I don't like it. And that's what Ecclesiastes chapter 7, especially verses 1 through 14, is calling us. To look at the good versus the better. Saying something better is out there for you. Even if it doesn't look like it, because, man, this does not look better. It is better. And so we're going to read here in chapters 7, verses 1 through 14. I'm going to leave those up there as our reminders here of the challenge here that Ecclesiastes chapter 7 is calling us to look at. And so if you would join me in your scripture insert, he's going to teach us the value, really, of difficult things over pleasant things. And that's kind of a difficult thing there. Because there's some things in life that are pleasant, and there's some things in life that are difficult. And he's going to challenge us to say, maybe those difficult things, like chewing through broccoli, is actually better for us than we understand. And so we read, starting in verse 1, "A good name is better than precious ointment, and the day of death better than the day of birth. It is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Sorrow is better than laughter, for by sadness of face the heart is made glad. The heart of the wise is in the house of the mourning, and the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. It is better for a man to hear the rebuke of the wise than to hear the song of fools. For as the crackling of thorns under a pot, so is the laughter of fools. This also is vanity. Surely oppression drives the wise into badness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. Better is the end of a thing than its beginning, and the patient in spirit is better than the proud in spirit. Be not quick in your spirit to become angry, for anger lodges in the hearts of fools. Say not, why were the former days better than these? For it is not from wisdom that you ask this. Wisdom is good with an inheritance, an advantage to those who see the sun. For the protection of wisdom is like the protection of money, and the advantage of knowledge is that wisdom preserves the life of him who has it. Consider the work of God. Who can make straight what he has made crooked? In the day of prosperity be joyful. In the day of adversity consider, God has made one as well as the other, so that man may not find out anything that will be after him. And so we see here these kind of challenging verses. And it starts off real simple. We have this series of better statements. In the Hebrew, all these verses here kind of start off with this word tov, good. So each one of these, this is just a series of good statements. Better, this is better, this is better, this is better, this is better. It kind of gets broken up in English because in order to make the sentence kind of make sense in English, you kind of have to rearrange the words. But this is all asking us to be what is better. Focus on something better. There's something better out there for us. And there's also a lot of wordplay in here, because even this first one here, this good name is better than precious ointment. There's a wordplay here, because a name in Hebrew is Shem, and the word for ointment is Shemen, so it's Shem and Shemen. So it's kind of there's this kind of rhyming, kind of punish wordplay here, and it doesn't necessarily translate into English, but it's there behind this. And I think there's a playfulness here where it's challenging us to look at some hard stuff, but also, lighten up just a tiny bit here. It's very serious, but not take yourself too seriously. And this opening comparison kind of sets the tone there by saying, a good name is better than ointment. And this seems fairly straightforward. We hear throughout the scriptures these types of things. It sounds very much like the Solomon of Proverbs, kind of poking into the drab exterior of Ecclesiastes. We have this kind of Solomon, the proverb writer, kind of poking his head in there, repeating something that we read in Proverbs. In Proverbs 22, verse 1, we have, a good name is to be chosen rather than great riches, and favor is better than silver or gold. And so we're told here that a name is better than ointment, that your reputation is better than ointment. And ointment is quite valuable, and a name is worth even more than that. So this isn't saying this thing is utterly worthless, and this thing has all the value in the world. It's saying there's something that has value, but there's something better. This is all about something that is better. Just like this is fine and good, but there's something better. And so yes, ointment is great. It's worth quite a bit of money. We know from Mark 14, verses 4 through 5, that some people were even upset when a woman broke a container of ointment and put it on Jesus because of its great value. They were some of those who said to themselves, we read in Mark 14, why was this ointment wasted like this? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. So they scolded her. So ointment has great value. But it says greater value is found in a name. And that kind of sets the tone for the comparisons to follow as we have these things that are compared and there's something better. This is not a thing of saying, well, this thing is worthless, and then this thing has all the value. It's saying, this is something that's good, but there's something better. And I say that because right off the bat here, it takes a hard turn towards what could be very pessimistic at the second half of verse 1 there. And nothing in this first part prepares us for the body blow of the second half as it goes from a good name is better than ointment, and then right into, and death is better than birth. And it's like, okay, well, I thought we were just talking about ointment and reputations and stuff here. You seem to have taken a pretty hard turn here, Mr. Ecclesiastes, Mr. the preacher here. This is a hard turn. But just like the ointment in a better name, it's not saying that this is not the pessimistic outlook where he's saying, I hate my life and I want to die, like he has said before. This is him just facing into something real, right? To say, everything has a time. There's a time for birth and a time for death. Ecclesiastes had that. There's a time to be born and a time to die, that there's these times and seasons of life, and he's calling us to that to say there is a rhythm here. In the day of one's birth, in the day of one's death, one of these things is better, and it's not the one we might think. That the day of one's birth is great. Again, just like the ointment, has great value, but the day of one's death is greater still. It is something better. And Paul himself expressed this idea in Philippians 1:21 through 23, where he said, for me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. He said the same thing. Well, my death, living is one thing. I enjoy my life, and I'm doing stuff, and I'm serving Christ, but to die is gain. He said, if I live in the flesh, that might be a fruitful labor to me. Yet which will I choose? I cannot tell. For I'm hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is far better. And so it's not pessimism, it's just saying the thing that I have after I die is something far better. I entered into this world, especially in the light of everything that Ecclesiastes has laid out to us. So much of this life is vanity. So much of this life is pain. Ecclesiastes is a real look at the real life that we really live under the sun. And is a life that is not always comfortable. You wake up in the morning, your back hurts, I fell. I'm probably going to have to go to the clinic later today. I fell and I banged up my elbow, so if I'm not using this arm that much, it's because my elbow is kind of jacked up right now. But we fall, we get hurt, we have pain, we know loss. And so he's saying, yes, birth is something, but birth is you're entering into something, a life under the sun. But death is an exit from life under the sun. And when you leave this world under the sun, just like Paul says, that it is something far better. For those who know God, and especially, and Paul is talking about this on the other side of the cross, and to us on the other side of the cross, when you leave this life, you're entering into something better. And it's not saying go, just end it. It's just saying, no, there's a time and a season for these things. Know which one is better. This is a call for perspective here. And verses 2 through 4 flesh this out in the why even further by saying it's not just that one is better than the other one, but let's explore a little bit further as to the whys by telling us about this something better that is found in maybe where we don't expect it. Because we expect things to be like these cookies here, nice and sweet and yummy, but sometimes life is like the broccoli. It's, it's broccoli. I don't know, I don't like broccoli. I'm just going to rail into this is roasting broccoli, and I don't mean over a fire. We're just going to lay into the broccoli. And so we're told here in verses 2 through 4 that essentially there's a spiritual broccoli. There's something that we have to go through in life that is hard, that is not good, doesn't taste good. It might be hard to eat, or it might be hard to swallow, but it's something that we need. Even if we don't want it, it is something that is good for us. And these verses present that to us by telling us first that the funeral is better than a party. It is something to note that in the wisdom and providence of God, that this would be the passage that I preach this week, as I spent the first half of this week at the bedside of someone who was dying. And the week before that, I lost my own aunt, and someone who was very close to me. I'm practically a second mother in my childhood. I lived in her home. And she passed away the week before last week, and then this week saw the death of Helen Fleshman, a church member of ours, and I was down there on the day of her death. And it's something that in the providence of God we have that God would have this be the passage to preach today, of all things. And I can tell you that death causes us to see, if we let it, the realities that Ecclesiastes has been trying to teach us all along, that death, well, his reminder that life is short. Life is short. And that's been something that's rung throughout all of Ecclesiastes. Life is short. And death causes us to see that, to look it straight in the face and say, yes, life is short. We try to distract ourselves with that. We try to fill our lives with meaningless distractions from what really matters, which is God. Life is short. God is what matters. And we try to distract from all that because we say, I don't want to face death. We talk about things, we use euphemisms and stuff. People pass away, right? They go on to a better place. We talk about these things, and not necessarily that they're necessarily wrong, but we shy away from the fact of even saying the word. We almost choke on it. Death. It almost sounds cruel. It almost sounds crass. If I was to tell you that someone died, it almost sounds crass and rude because that's not the way we talk about it. No, they passed away. They passed away. They didn't die, they passed away. Or they didn't die, but their fight came to an end. Or we have all these euphemisms and these things here. But Ecclesiastes says, no. Life is short. A funeral is better than a party. Death brings us greater wisdom. Even Moses saw that when he wrote Psalm 90, verse 12, which is a psalm written by Moses. Not all the psalms are written by David. In Psalm 90, verse 12, Moses says to God, praying to God, so teach us to number our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. Moses says, teach me to number my days so that I can know wisdom. Because that is the beginning of wisdom, is to fear the Lord, but also know that my days are numbered. And I was reminded as I was looking at this of Jesus' words in Luke 13, 1 through 5, where Jesus is asked why these Galileans were slaughtered by the Romans while they were doing their worship. And Jesus retorts to them about another disaster that occurred and says, oh, well, or those 18 on whom the Tower of Siloam fell and killed them, do you think that they were worse offenders than all the others who lived in Jerusalem? He says, well, you want to ask this question about why these people were killed. Why those people, why they die in these circumstances? And he tells them twice in that passage, in verse 3 and again in verse 5, the exact same phrase, that unless you repent, you will likewise perish. He calls us to this, and he catches us with the reality that death is real for all of us. And it doesn't matter if I fell the other day and I hurt my elbow. I could have died. I could walk out the doors right now and die, fall down the stairs and die. I could live for another 50 years. All right, in the end, it doesn't matter, because what's 50 years? For those of you who have lived 50 years or more, well, it seems really short, doesn't it? What's another 10 years? What's another 50 years? What does all that matter? What matters is, are you right with God? And that's what Jesus is getting at. He says, it doesn't matter why those people died the way that they did. They died. And you're going to die too. Repent, or you're going to die the same way that they did. And Ecclesiastes calls us to the same thing, the same note here, to say, you need to understand that you're going to die. That is why the house of mourning is better than the house of feasting, because feasting is great. And again, this isn't I'm saying, well, that's worthless. Feasting is great. I enjoy a buffet. I enjoy a potluck. Okay, maybe a bit too much. But a funeral will shape us in a way that a potluck won't. And that's what he's calling us to here. Calling us to the fact that the heart of the wise is in the house of mourning, and the heart of fools is in the house of mirth. Anybody can go and have a party. It doesn't take any great wisdom to have fun at a birthday party. It takes great wisdom, and it's hard to sit through a funeral. That's a trying experience. It is a crucible for us. And he tells us even more that sadness is better than laughter. And the first time I really dove deeply into Ecclesiastes was around the time that a new Pixar movie had come out called Inside Out. And if you've seen that movie, maybe no one watches movies here. I understand that, but I know you do, Devin. I know you've seen Inside Out as well. But in Inside Out, it's a story about it's obviously a cartoon, and inside this girl's head that has all her emotions, there's joy, sadness, anger, and all these things. And the main emotion in the girl's life so far has been joy. And joy is kind of default in charge. But over the course of the movie, sadness is seen, for the first half of the movie, is just a little more of a nuisance. In fact, joy even draws a circle on the floor and says, okay, you just stay over here. You're in charge of this area over here. To just try to push her over there aside, because sadness, what good is sadness, right? Well, over the whole course of the movie there's lots of life changes that she goes through, and we realize that sadness is the most important one of the emotions that's there, because it is through sadness that joy can come. In fact, one of the key memories that this girl has is this memory of all her teammates coming around and lifting her up after they lost the game. And it's sadness who comes and says, yes, they all came around you and lifted you up and cheered you because you were sad. It was through feeling sad that you were able eventually to feel the joy. And so Ecclesiastes has the same truth here. In Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 3, that it is sadness that brings joy. That going through things allows us to do that. We can run away from sadness, but in the end, the true thing that's best for us is to just be sad. Cry it out, hug it out, go through that, and then we can have fun. And I've been through that. I've been to funerals, and everybody has their crying and their weeping and all that. But you'll notice if you've been to a funeral, at some point in the reception, you start to hear some laughter. You start to have some joy. As people have moved, at least superficially, maybe not fully, but they've moved from the crying and from all of that to then remembering the fun things and to truly enjoying each other's fellowship and the time they have together. They've moved from sadness, because from the sadness actually came great joy, because they've moved through something together and now they experience a joy together. Like the great forces of God's creation that carve canyons and shape mountains, grief and sadness and mourning are the forces that shape us. We're not shaped by sugar and sweets and yummy things and fun times. We are shaped. We are shaped by the things that have to scour our soul, just like the canyons and the mountains and the great forces that shape our earth. They're rough and they scrape away, and they do this by friction, and they erode. If you've seen the Grand Canyon, this immense canyon carved by wind and water, grief, sadness, and pain are what shape us into who God would have us to be. And we can let them shape us into something beautiful. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 11 told us that God is making all things beautiful in their time. And we can look to that and say, yes, God is making me beautiful and he's shaping me into that if I let him. Or I can continue to fill my life with distractions and things that take me away from what really matter in life. And working in those very things, they work out his will in us, as Philippians 1:6 calls us to remind us that Paul says, I am sure of this, that he who began a good work in you will bring it to completion on the day of Jesus Christ. That God is working something in you. He's working to bring you to a place and to make you into a person that maybe you don't know who that is now. I think back to who I was 20 years ago, and man, wow, what a totally different person. If 20-year-old me was to walk in here, you'd be like, who the heck are you? All right? And I'm sure the same could be said for any one of you. And if you look back at the things that changed your life, that really made a big impact and carved out who you are, it was not that party you went to. Maybe it was that time you were by on someone's deathbed. Maybe that was when it happened. I can tell you that I was shaped more by standing at the graveside of my daughter, Caitlin, in Virginia, than I ever was. Sorry. Than I ever was at any party. I wasn't trying to. Sorry. And sometimes being a pastor, you just get Just like broccoli is good for us, and its vitamins and nutrients build us, as we tell our kids, into being stronger people. These things that we go through in life shape us if we let them. Too much of either isn't necessarily what it's called for either. Yes, we can have the cookies, we can have good times. But having this makes this all the more enjoyable. Having this makes my life actually mean something. He moves on from that big deep thing there and almost seems to take a hard turn to another direction by talking about wisdom and folly, by telling us that it's better for a man to hear rebuke of the wise. It seems like he almost knows that this is almost too much to bear, by then bringing in some humor and tells us the second set of better things that focus on wisdom and foolishness. And it might seem unconnected, but they all connect at the end of it all, and we'll get to that last few verses there and see how they connect here. But it's not a random assortment of Proverbs. And they continue that previous thought of wisdom and adversity and the sufferings that we have in this life. And we look at this and we say, well, it tells us here that the wisdom of the wise is something, the rebuke of the wise is something better than the joy that we might feel with people. You go to the song of fools. right? Again, kind of carrying that idea that the thing that might be hard to bear might be the thing that actually helps you. I know for me it is harder to hear someone's rebuke, obviously, than to hear someone singing something silly. I like VeggieTales as much as the next person, and VeggieTales has all those wonderful little silly songs. And those silly songs are great for what they are, but the rebuke of the wise means a lot more than hearing about Larry the Cucumber singing about a water buffalo. Only the people who watch VeggieTales will get that one, but... And so, we are told here that the Song of Fools is something, but wisdom and its rebuke are better. And we're told here that in this kind of wordplay thing here, it tells us that the crackling of thorns under a pot is like the laughter of fools, that is vanity. And there's a play on words here, there's a pun here, because like the sound in the Hebrew here, it's like the sound of serim under the seer, which is the pot, is caught by one theologian in a paraphrase that says, like nettles crackling under kettles is what this is talking about. So there's a rhyme here, there's some play on words here. Like nettles under kettles, thorns, you might take some thorn branches and throw them in a fire, but all they're going to do is crackle and pop and make a bunch of noise, and they're not going to actually add up to much. And I've never actually thrown thorns or nettles into a fire, but my kids think it's very hilarious when we were camping and stuff to take big bunches of green pine needles and throw them in the fire pit when we're trying to cook dinner. And because it makes a bunch of noise and it sizzles and crackles and pops and has sparks and stuff like that. But it doesn't amount to anything. All it does is sizzle, crack, and pop and make a bunch of noise. And it doesn't actually contribute to the heat of actually cooking the food because it sizzles, cracks, pops, and is done. It doesn't actually contribute to the fire. And that's what he's saying here, that the laughter of fools, just like that crackling of the stuff under the pot, it makes a bunch of noise, but it doesn't mean anything. And that's the laughter of fools. And so again, it pulls us towards here in this seemingly unconnected way, telling us about madness and oppression. And again, it seems almost on this kind of turn here. So what are we even talking about here? As it turns from the oppression drives the wise into madness, and a bribe corrupts the heart. That there's a place, it would seem, where the difficulties of life almost might be too much. So yes, suffering has its value, mourning has its value, but if you take that too far, if you go to the point where you're causing mourning and suffering for other people, that's not what we're trying to do here either. We're not trying to make people miserable for the sake of making them miserable, because it says here that this oppression, it drives the wise into madness. Yes, feel the pain. Yes, mourn. Yes, grieve. These things are good, and there is a betterness to them, but don't be an oppressor to people, bringing them down, because that's madness. That actually takes away from wisdom. And we're told that the end of a thing is better than the beginning of a thing, and that patience is better than pride. And these things all seem pretty straightforward. We're told here. I mean, if I said the end is better, that kind of echoes back to saying that the birth is better, death is better than birth. When something is over and it's done, it's over and done. Even the grieving process, when it's over and done, it's over and done. Maybe it never gets fully over and done, but it's over and done. And it's better to be patient. Just be patient. God is working something. Again, calling back to Ecclesiastes chapter 3, where it's told us that there's a time for everything. There's a time for this and a time for that. And there's all these times and seasons of life. Be patient. The end will be there some point. The season might be for death now, but it will be for birth later. The season might be now for planting, but sooner or later it will be harvesting. The time right now might be for war, but the time for peace will come. The time for hate might be now, but the time for love will come. And so he said, yes, the end of a thing is better than the beginning. Be patient. Don't be prideful thinking that you've got this under control and you know where this is going and you know where you are in the times and seasons of life, because you don't. And so he says, don't be proudful. Don't be proud. Be patient. Be patient in life. And lastly, it calls us here in verses 10 through 14 to wrap it, as it ties it all in together, to tell us that godly wisdom is what gives us perspective. Because true wisdom is about perspective. How do you see the world? The right perspective can change everything. And this perspective that he calls us to here in these verses, these are seeking to give us a better perspective, to see that mourning and sadness and pain in life under the sun are something better than laughing and partying under the sun. Just like the broccoli and the cookie, the acceptance of this being actually better for us, all right, this takes a perspective. You have to have some perspective. I can try to go, if I was to go down there and try to give this to Owen, my 4-year-old, he's not going to like it. And I can tell him till I'm blue in the face, this is good for you, this is good for you, this is good for you. And he's going to say, I don't believe you, and he's not going to accept it. I know it because I have a greater perspective because I'm 39 years old and I know that broccoli is good for you. That came from perspective. Came from a lifetime of understanding and knowledge. And what's going to rule our lives? The perspective informed by wisdom and lifetime of understanding and knowledge, or by the desires and thoughts of a child? And he calls us here to have some perspective and say, don't say, why are things... And I've quoted this verse. If you've talked to me about stuff around there, I've quoted this verse quite a bit. Nostalgia. Don't get bogged down by nostalgia. It says here, say not, why were the former days better than these ones? Because this is not from wisdom. He doesn't even tell us why it's not from wisdom. It's like, come on, it's not from wisdom. Say not, why were the former days better than these? No, because it's really not. And that's why he rebukes us for that. Don't get bogged down by nostalgia. Don't get bogged down by looking at the former days. 2 reasons that I'm going to throw in there. It was never as good as you remember. And secondly, you can't go back anyways. And so with that in mind, it's not from wisdom that we say that. When we say, oh, the good old days, remember those good old days? Oh, yeah, those were something. Well, you know what? Again, they weren't as good as you remember, and you can't go back. The Israelites learned that as they looked at the second temple being built, and they looked at the second temple being built and said, oh, it's not nearly as great as Solomon's temple. And Ezra and in Haggai, they saw this being built, and a bunch of those people mourned and they cried, and they said, this is just such a pitiful example compared to that. But they were rebuked by those prophets, and they were told, and they're told here by Solomon here, let bygones be bygones, don't look to that. God's still working his plan, and the best was yet to come. Because the final completion of the second temple under Herod ended up being even 10 times bigger than Solomon's temple. But that wasn't something that they knew about right then. They saw this beginning, they said, this is something else. And even that second temple that was built and finalized in Jesus' time under Herod is not something that was even what the true temple was about, because even then, it was just pointing to the living temple that would be Christ. In John 1:14 and in 2:19 through 22, Jesus says that he was the temple to come. He was the true and better temple. So even then, they didn't understand all that. And he calls us here, I want to end with verses 13 through 14. I'm going to skip a couple for time's sake here, because this is the punchline, I think, of the whole book of Ecclesiastes, and the heart of all wisdom that is calling to us here. And it brings together everything that's been said about all of this stuff, about the mourning and all these things. In verses 13 through 14, he calls us to consider the work of God. Consider the work of God. What he has made crooked, who can make straight? Or who can make straight what he has made crooked, to put it the other way? Right? And this isn't about whether or not the things that it's about evil crookedness. This is just, if God made the tree branch do this thing, you can't straighten it. I mean, you can go out there and try, but you're just going to break the branch. Right? You can go out there and you can try, but you're not going to be able to straighten what he has made. God has made it the way that he has made it. And that's that. And verse 14, here, 7:14, is one of my favorite verses in the whole Bible. And holds all of this together because it calls us here to consider 2 things. It tells us here, in the day of prosperity, be joyful. And that's easy, right? In the day when things are going well for you, in the day of good, literally in the Hebrew, be joyful. Just be joyful. Celebrate. On the good days, think of the sunny and the fun and the blessed things that God has done to you. And on those days, praise God for what he has done. Join in with Psalm 13:6 and says, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Psalm 104:33, I will sing to the Lord as long as I live. I will sing praise to my God while I have my being. Sing out with Psalm 136 and say, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever. That's the easy part. But he counters that and brings in something else to say, and in the day of adversity, on that difficult day, on that hard day, remember something, think about something, that God made that day too. Because it's easy when it's all sun and fun to praise God. But he calls us here to look at something hard, and that's where it all comes together here. It all comes to a head. Everything we talk about, grief and mourning and all this stuff that's been happening, it calls it to a head here and says, think about this right here. The grief and sorrow, all these things, the hardness of life, everything brought right here. Will you trust God on that day? That's the true crucible of our faith. That's the hard. This is where rubber meets the road. Do you trust God? Not when it's sun and fun, but on the day of adversity, will you trust God? Will you join Job in crying out, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. Those words were called out from a place of adversity, and they're a miracle of God's grace in his life. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a lot harder than eating broccoli. But that's the perspective of wisdom of God. That's the perspective that he calls us to have. We can't understand why God uses adversity and prosperity as he does. We just can't. And that's what this ends up with by saying, listen, you're not going to be able to find anything out after you. God did this and God did this. I'm not God. I can't figure it out. But even when I can't figure it out, am I going to trust him? Romans 8:28 gets to the same point, telling us that all things work together for good for those who love God and who are called according to his purpose. And that's what he calls us to here. This is right here. This is what the heart of it all is saying to us, that God is good even in those hard times. That those hard times are better for us than we even understand. That sometimes we need to eat our veggies and trust God when he says, it's good for you. Trust me. I know what I'm doing. And we look to Christ, who in Hebrews 12:2, we're told that we look to Christ, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. The peace that we know, and the peace that we know in this life, doesn't come from the circumstances in our life. Some verses I've said at a couple people's bedside as they died come from John 14. In John 14, verses 1 through 2, Jesus says, let not your hearts be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. Skipping down a few verses, Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus says, there's a place for us to be. I go to prepare a place for you. Don't let your hearts be troubled by what happens in this life. And if we question ourselves, well, I don't know how to get there, Jesus says, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And he tells us in John 14:27 that peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you, not as the world gives do I give to you. So let not your hearts be troubled. That yes, the troubles of this life are troubles. But that is our ultimate perspective here. I can face the grave, I can face the funeral, I can face my own death and the death of loved ones. I can try to keep my head on straight, and I can look things face on by keeping my eyes on Jesus, on his cross, and his blood, which was shed for me. So we close in prayer.